for joining us.
I would love to welcome Kimberly. Thank you. I hope you got here okay and it wasn't too much of a struggle. Welcome from the US. We're so grateful and glad to have you here. The day is enriched by your presence. It's been going so well. So many amazing speakers, Black mothers, midwife, practitioners, and Ruth has just given such a great talk. But we have you here, and the author of The Big Letdown, the creator of the, so I've got my little one here. Okay, Sarah. Creator of the New Earth app, strategist, thinker, truth speaker. We're just grateful to have you here to share your wisdom, and yeah, we don't want to run over schedule, so I'll let you take it from there, Kimberly, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. First of all, big shout out and lots of gratitude to Ruth, who was the first to bring Black Breastfeeding Week to the UK. I'm so grateful for her continued advocacy and support. I am so excited to be here live from New York City, where it's still 9 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, brain's not working for logging on that early. Also, before I start, I wanted to share about why we, for me personally, this has been such an important work that you all are doing. If you don't know, my husband is Black British, and so I lived, that is my ex-husband, in case anybody's wondering what a husband is. That is the word I use for him. And so I lived and worked in London, in North London, living in North London for many years, and my children are both UK citizens. And so what's happening across the pond, since my children always live in two worlds, has been always very important to me. So just on a personal note. And as Ruth was mentioning, you know, what we know is that racism is not border bound, right? It can traverse oceans. And although what we're experiencing here in the US has a different racist history, what happened was that this idea of racism in its unique form that was experienced in America became exported all around the world. An ideology around whose lives are valued, whose skin color is valued, and then moving on from there. And so it's very telling to see what has now been documented, although we know it has been going on for years, around Black maternal mortality rates, Black maternal morbidity rates in the UK, and how they are now paralleling and mirroring what we've been experiencing here in the US. And that is a function of the great job of exporting racism. And that idea of racism is really about valuing, right? It's assigning value based on skin color. When we think about who's valued, who's not valued, whose children are valued, whose children are viewed as problematic. All of these things come into play, particularly as we talk about breastfeeding. As Ruth also mentioned, you know, there's been a history of aggressive infant formula marketing, particularly to Black and Brown folks and in Black and Brown communities. This happens globally, we know, going back to early days of Nestle boycotts. But what we do know is that historically, and I talk about this in my book, breastfeeding has been associated with good mothering, right? It has been a good mothering ideal. And so when we think about who's considered to be a good mother, that has been mostly attached to white women, particularly white women of means and education. And so when we think about what happens in the dynamic of that, right? When something has been attached to good mothering and Black mothers are not viewed as good mothers, then they aren't viewed as people capable of doing something like that, right? Think about it, breastfeeding, you need to be able to know your baby's feeding cues, and you need to be able to, know your baby's getting enough by pees and poops and other things. There's a relationship there that requires maternal knowledge. And so when we think about Black women, I often say that we have been viewed, even in your country, as being perfectly capable and desirable for taking care of other people's children, but somehow viewed as incapable of taking care of our own, right? And that's the lie that was told about Black mothers all over the world. particularly in the US and also in the UK, in my experience and my mothering journey there. And so what we have is stereotypes, and those stereotypes are impacting who's receiving breastfeeding support. So when you are not viewed as a good mother, here's what they do trust. They trust you to pour something in this bottle, measure those ounces, report back to me, and this way I know that it's been done, right? I can't really trust you, but I do trust the numbers. And so this is why we disproportionately see Black mothers who are not given information about breastfeeding, who are told to, who are encouraged to quit at the first sign of any type of challenge. Whereas others can be encouraged. It's always very interesting to me. This may be a common conversation in the UK, and I know it is, around being pressured to breastfeed. You know, people are complaining that people are being pressured to breastfeed. I often say, I would love to see Black women being pressured to breastfeed. Like, I've worked in Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, another year in Detroit. Every place that I've went, nobody is being pressured to breastfeed. And so this is a white woman's problem. And so when you hear this idea about guilt and shame, it really is a class-based privilege to be pressured to breastfeed. That is someone who wants you to do it because they've made a judgment about who you are and they think that's the best thing for you. And so what we find on the other side of that is that too many times Black mothers are not being supported in breastfeeding. And so when we look at what happened here because of that, for me, my entry into this work, because I really started talking about pregnancy in my very first book, The Mocha Manual to a Fabulous Pregnancy, which came out back in 2005, when we weren't really having this robust conversation about race and its impact on Black women and their pregnancy and birth outcomes. Nobody was really talking about that. People looking at me when I was crazy when we were talking about racism being a factor. But what we know is that because of that pregnancy journey, Black women disproportionately have babies who were born too small, too sick, and too soon. And in here, that has contributed to a high Black infant mortality rate, right? And so we know that despite their best efforts, studies in the US have proven that even college-educated Black women have worse outcomes than a white woman who didn't graduate high school. So income is not protective, education are not protective factors for us, right? And so when we look at this, you know, for us, we cannot decouple the birth experience from the breastfeeding experience, because how we give birth disproportionately impacts why our babies need breast milk the most. It is through no fault of our own, through, you know, just living as we do as Black women, we are just statistically more likely to have this adverse outcome. And then on top of that, statistically more likely to not receive the care that we deserve. So it's really a double whammy, right? And then we know that breast milk is certainly important for babies who are born too small, too sick, or too soon, and certainly the best optimal infant nutrition for all infants. And so we really want to make sure that we're having a conversation that balances both. Is that me? I don't think I have alerts on my computer, but I will silence it, to make sure that we are not having anything that, I don't think this is me. I don't have anything on. Okay. So to make sure that we are connecting birth and the breastfeeding experience. The other thing that's really important to consider as we think about what we're learning about what's going on with Black women in the UK is that so many times lactation consultants, they may meet a Black mama soon after birth. They're excited. They're like, hey, I'm so excited. And she's not that excited. And sometimes lactation consultants are like, well, she had an attitude. Well, you have no idea what she went through on that birth experience. You don't have any idea of the disrespect that she encountered, the ways that she was dismissed, what happened to her, how her wishes may have been ignored, and you show up very happy and smiley, thank you very much. But you need to understand that just because you aren't met with the same smile that you greet people with, it's not an indication of an attitude. It's an indication that there may have been trauma on the other side. And how do we show compassion for that? Not look at that as I'm not wanted here, take it personally, but actually to have an understanding of the lived experience of that Black mama and then deal with her from that, right? What could she have gone through on the other side that could be impacting that? It's really important that we don't see these two experiences as disentangled from each other, because they're not. One thing that I wanted to mention, and then I want to move myself to questions so we can have a discussion, is really just understanding where we go from here. And I want to speak particularly first to the white women in the audience. One of the things that I've been really grateful for is the advanced conversation that we're having about racism and bias, white privilege, and the ways that white women need to do their work to make sure they're not bringing that bias to their work, particularly with Black and Brown communities, and that they are, you know, calling people in, right? When things are happening to Black women, how are white women being supportive of that, right? And I mean publicly. And so what is the work of white women as we advance Black breastfeeding? Well, certainly we have to first start with an acknowledgement of the contributions to getting us in this mess, right? None of it intentional, we understand that. But we do also understand that many of the models that were created, going back to the Leche League, which has done phenomenal work around this world, fought legally for rights, protection, save mamas, we get that. But the fact of the matter is, their model of peer support was predominantly in white suburban neighborhoods and predominantly excluded women who were working outside the home, right? And so now you have a model that has nothing to do with the majority of women of color who didn't live in suburban neighborhoods and have historically have a larger percentage of labor force participation than white women, more working, right? And so this model, this amazing model that the Leche League created, which was unfortunately centered on white women, became a model that was replicated, right? It didn't factor in the ways that Black women work patterns or Black and Brown folks work. It didn't factor in these larger family structures that everybody's talking about. It didn't factor in the role of grandmas and aunties. It didn't factor in our unique family structures. And so we've been replicating and practicing a form of breastfeeding support that wasn't made for Black and Brown folks. So the work that we have to do, and we ask white women to understand this, is to actively undo, right? And now we are not building systems. We are not perpetuating harm by creating programs, policies, ideas that do not center Black women first, right? We can't fix something without centering those who are being most burdened by the disparities in the issue. And so we must center Black women. Now, I know that is an uncomfortable comment for some white women. And I'm gonna ask you just to be uncomfortable for a minute. And I thank you for being here. But the moment of discomfort for us to move forward in a movement for equity, right? And so we have a saying here, and I hope you're picking up there, which is nothing for us without us. Nothing for us without us. So if you are even thinking about how you want to help, that's a whole nother presentation. If you want to think about how you want to help, then remember, nothing for us without us. If you are not partnering with, centering Black women in how you seek to address disparities, then you still have some more work to do. Now, the second thing I want to say about that, the way that you can do that is actually being in community, having real conversations. This is not reading some study and thinking you understand Black women because you read the study, you read the Embrace study, you read this study, you read that study. That's not an understanding. That's you trying to have an interpretation. And understanding comes from being in dialogue, being in relationship, being in community, unpacking your white privilege to show up full and present and supportive. That's what we're talking about. So I'm asking you to dig in for the sake of the mothers that I know that we all care about, for the sake of eliminating racial disparities, but it will be an uncomfortable journey. It will be an uncomfortable journey. And I want you to lean into it. Lean into it. And also for us to allow space for mistakes. I think that has been something that we do have to work on, that when white women are well-intentioned and they make mistakes, give them space, right? That's our work to do that. But what we're not going to do is tell you what to do. Okay, now, just to be clear, if anybody right now wants to do their anti-racist work, if you go into Google and type in how to be anti, I promise you, it will self-populate the rest. I promise you. There have been lists, books, articles, especially since the murder of George Floyd. You don't ask Black women to help you be anti-racist, right? You need to start the work on your own, check back in. We're busy in our communities, okay? So this is our ask. We want you to do the work. Lots of great classes, lots of white women running great classes, books, Google it, do some work amongst yourselves, check back in, we're busy. So while we are working in our community, heads down, focused, and you all are working on your anti-racist work and working on being allies, now we have the potential for building a movement for all of us, right? That's really centered on equity, not centered on one ideology, one person, one idea of motherhood, one idea of support, one idea of what breastfeeding mothers look like, one idea of what breastfeeding is. The potential is limitless. Limitless. So I invite you into that opportunity for us to really build a global movement of equity, particularly in our countries where we are seeing some real concerning disparities across racial lines. So I'm going to pause there. I'm going to quickly check the chat, but if it's okay, I'm okay with anyone just unmuting and sharing any thoughts. I'm just quickly going to the chat. Yes, the narrative of the strong Black woman. Absolutely. We are not machines. We are humans, and we deserve to experience the whole suite of emotions, right? We can be strong and soft, and those two things always go together, always go together. You know, I think that white women have done a great job of saying that they need help, asking for help, paying for help, things we probably have not done. And we've been on the other side of that narrative, not doing anything. I don't know if you've been seeing what's been going on in the US with Child Protective Services taking children from their mothers. It's been disgusting to watch. I'm not going to talk about it and re-traumatize myself. But what I do find interesting was that the other day on the news, there was a white mother who apparently had marijuana cannabis gummies, and her child ate the gummies and overdosed and spent days in the hospital. But this white mother was on the national news talking about how her infant ate the cannabis gummies, how she learned a lesson. And all I could think was, if this was a Black mother, her child would be gone. So when we understand, when we say that Black motherhood is different, right? That we don't get to make mistakes, that we don't get to say, oops, that we don't get to have a moment of learning. Please understand what we're talking about. Please understand what we're talking about. And that, you know, our fears for our children are real. Our fears for our children are real, and that we have a journey that you could never understand. And when you can bring that compassion and knowledge to your work, how powerful can you be? And actually supporting someone, not based on your idea of what that support should look like, but rooted in their lived experience with compassion, empathy, and understanding, right? And then we couple that with allyship, which means sometimes we follow, lead, and sometimes we need to get out the way and support those doing the work, knowing that they may be more effective. If we're centering ourselves, we're not going to get there. we're not going to get there. Anyone else want to jump in? Well, there's a lot of talk about volunteerism and the cost of it. This is an issue. I think that you know, we've been able to create nonprofit streams of income for organizations. In this country, the IBCLC market is very robust. I live in New York City, where a lactation consultant will cost you $400 to $600 an hour, basic. And so, you know, it is a very robust field for licensed professionals, particularly in areas with high numbers of white women of means. It is, so it's important to consider how that looks differently for different people as well, in terms of what's happening with IBCLC, which I also recognize is a huge investment of time and money. I mean, I remember seeing a doctor at a conference saying that, you know, she's a physician and an IBCLC, and she said it was easier for her to become a doctor than IBCLC. She found it far more confusing, you know, like the pathway was too, she was like, I figured out how to be a physician easier than I did an IBCLC. And so that process needs a lot of work. Those obstacles are actually barriers to Black and Brown folks. Some of them may have been created intentionally. And that's also the work that we need to undo. I hear someone.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was on mute. I'm here going,
Okay, oh, I appreciate that.
Hi, Kimberly. This has been an amazing event today. Thank you to those ladies who have put it on, and it's great seeing you here. I've been looking at this chat talking about the IBCLC, and in my mind, I'm thinking all the things you said about the barriers. The work that we do in the community, I was trained by a great lady called Louise Oliver, I think she's on here today, as a peer supporter. We didn't quite get into hospital to support our mums, but I use that knowledge everywhere I go. I don't need to be an IBCLC to support my sister or my Sudanese neighbor or the lady across the road. And in the organization I work in, we don't do particularly Black breastfeeding, but as a doula and as a woman who works in the Black community, I impart the knowledge that I have learned, I learn from the women. So some of these things, as you said, are barriers. We need to find ways to enable the peer support model to flourish in our Black and Brown communities, you know? And sometimes the things we do out of love. Money will come when it comes, if it needs to come. But when you love your Black mom and you love your brown mom, when you go around there with your dish or whatever, when the babies come, you have those conversations, you talk about what they need, you ask them what they need. So sometimes, as you said, these organizational ways of working in our communities are the barriers in itself. And sometimes we just need to go back to basics. You know, the family and the community need to understand and learn about this, because we make assumptions in the Black community as well about breastfeeding. We already know it, you know. And even as mums, when I had my last one, I just assumed we were going to have a smooth breastfeeding journey, but she had a tongue tie. And if I'd have known about the things like Carmel's doing, I would have been a bit more prepared. But we need to educate the community, because the mum doesn't birth on her own, she births in a community. So that's all I wanted to say.
No, I think those are really valid points. I want to comment really briefly, and I see that Lola has her hand up. I wanted just to say, like, when we talk about this certification, it is an issue, right? Because there's been a hierarchy created. And the fact of the matter is, not every mom needs an IBCLC. Not every mom does. Some do need just some, you know, another mom. They may need something that a lactation consultant. There's so many layers. So we have to acknowledge that. And in our country, people have made IBCLC the gold standard, because with that, you can work in certain settings. However, we know that peer support, again, which was the La Leche League model, right, that has been so well celebrated, is a critical model, right? It's a critical peer-to-peer support. But the question is, how do we make sure that those doing that work are paid? I think that is important. We are driven by love, but I don't believe that we have to struggle. I don't believe anyone should have to struggle. Obviously for us, that looks like getting reimbursed by health insurance companies. That's a whole different conversation when your health service is nationalized. What is the role of foundations perhaps in providing this, other levels of support? It is a complicated issue. How do we as a community make the doula and the lactation consultant part of what we chip in for? Now, I don't know about y'all, but I've seen this on Instagram. People are having some really fancy baby showers. Some of these baby showers. Okay, so how do we at the baby shower pass the same pot, because we chipping in for the doula and the lactation consultant, right? Everybody can give 40 pounds, maybe 20, maybe 10, whatever you can. But how do we, those holding space for that birthing person, say this is something we want to do? If it can't be provided free, how do we create something? We have a lot of folks working on sliding scales here, really important to consider. So let's be creative and make sure that we can show that we value the care and time that's being given to put into these services. Lola?
I just wanted to say, I think Amanda had her hand up before me,
Oh.
so I'm not sure if she's spoken already. I don't know if Amanda wants to go before me or not.
No, I've spoken.
Oh, you have? Okay. All right. Yeah, I just wanted to lead on from qualifications. You know, I'm a midwife. I've been a midwife for about 18 years. I have 3 children and I've breastfed them all. And I found it really difficult to, I was having a conversation with one of my friends about having a qualification that enables you to support people with breastfeeding in your job. So I went down the IBCLC a while ago, and it was just too confusing. Like you were saying about that doctor, I found it much easier to train to be a midwife than I did to train to do the IBCLC. So I actually just stopped halfway through and I thought, this is absolutely ridiculous. And then after I had my daughter, I thought, I'm on maternity leave. I am doing nothing other than sitting and feeding this baby. Let me go over to the local breastfeeding cafe and speak to the midwife there and see if I can come and be peer support. But then again, that was almost as if they were putting obstacles in my way because I didn't work as a midwife in that area. So legally, I wasn't allowed to work as a midwife. It's like, but how about a mum who has a baby dangling off the end of her breast? Can I not just support people that way? And it was like they were almost putting obstacles in my way. And I thought about something very recently that my son's godmother said to me. She works for a charity, and I asked her, how did you start working for this charity? And she said, well, it's a long story, but the long and short of it is, I thought to myself that I really wanted to work for the church. And then I realized that actually the church is not just this building that I go to on Sunday, it's everywhere. And that's why I went to work for this charity. And so what I have found has been a godsend for me in trying to support people, but also knowing that I have 3 children. I don't often have the chance to go and sit and do a course, but I know about breastfeeding. I read about it every day and I live it every day, and I can support people. Apart from supporting people who are my friends and family, is things like this event, which I wouldn't have known about if people hadn't persuaded me to go on Instagram and on Twitter. But I do really also believe that, you know, we do it out of love, but actually we should be paid for our work as well. So I am definitely looking into situations which we can make us actually wanting to support people so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those two should not be mutually exclusive, right? And I think that we have to value the work. When, you know, I'm concerned about the credentializing and licensure, because that always is going to create barriers. And we're learning that right now as we try to work through getting more doulas and lactation consultants reimbursed. Someone's going to be asking for qualifications, and these are the things that we know create barriers. So you know, it's definitely a balance and a struggle going down that road. But I also want to encourage everyone to value virtual platforms. And one thing that COVID has taught us is that you can have access to anybody, right? And so people in New York who used to only be able to go to a breastfeeding group in New York now can have a lactation consultant in LA or in London to help them, right? And so if you're thinking about this from a business perspective, then how are you kind of leveraging where people are to really think beyond your local community and tap into virtual spaces and other opportunities for you to expand your practice. And then I think this idea of peer support being so critical, it is something that breastfeeding was always communal, right? It was always something that happened in your community. It is really since the medicalization of birth that we've had to create credentials around breastfeeding support. I mean, it just didn't happen until we were forced into hospital settings, and then hospitals required something, and then they built something, and it's just a mess. But what I am concerned about in the breastfeeding movement is this thing that creates a thing, well, you're not an IBCLC, and then the IBCLCs feel quote unquote threatened by these other layers of lactation support because they've spent time and money to become an IBCLC, and then why should you get paid if I'm not getting paid, and you should be paid less, and it's getting real dicey. It's getting real dicey. And so I don't have the answers, but I just want to put that out there, something that we should always consider, that remember that systems have never worked to serve women and mothers in general. And the more that we start to look like the medical field and we start replicating that model of credentials and hierarchy, we are actually becoming, in my fear, part of the problem. Right. And so I hope that we can just remember to see how we can have balance and not actually replicating a model that has done nothing but cause harm to mothers, birthing patterns, breastfeeding norms down the line. So let's just keep that in mind as we continue to work through this issue that needs to be resolved, Yes. Oh, good. I'm glad Anna Hall was talking about it. Yes. Yeah. And so we do see the hierarchies. Thank you, Maddie. And this is something that we need to address. Like what is valued, right? Is the community knowledge valued, or is that technical, scientific, I got this license valued? Even though, you having that credential could perhaps only be a function of money and time that someone else didn't have. Not a function of skill, intellect, expertise, none of those things. You had the money and the time, and that may be the only distinction between you and the other person. So let's be clear about that. Let's really make sure that we are centering equity always in what we do, not centering ourselves. It's not about you, it's not about me. It really has to be about the communities that we serve and how we constantly think about how we show up for them. Yes, agree, Maddie, centering privilege instead of the needs of the community. And if we, get into that, then we'll be, if we can just focus on the needs of the community first, then we can figure this out.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. We've got Marguerite's got her hand up, but we would love to speak with you all day. And yeah, there's lots of appreciation for what you've shared. Thank you so much. Marguerite, would you like to ask your question, and then we'll move on with the program?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thanks so much, Kimberly. And you're exactly right what you said at the end. I just qualified as an IBCLC, and I did it because I'm a midwife for 10 years, but actually don't get as good thing. And the situation in the UK is slightly different. A lot of our stuff isn't about it's not about getting paid for their breastfeeding support, but we just don't have enough in our community of people who are giving good evidence-based breastfeeding support. And I think the IBCLC did a benefit for me in giving me some of that training, but you don't have to actually do the course. And actually, because of COVID, I discovered I didn't have to pay thousands of pounds to do a course, to do an IBCLC exam and pass. And I'm happy to share that information with anybody who wants to know how to do it without having to pay for these very expensive courses, which I don't think actually are as necessary. So yeah.
Well, I agree. I just want to say this before we wrap up. To wrap up, Rosie, please. One, I agree. Like someone said, this was the credential that was created by someone, right? And usually as a tool to oppress other people. That's generally how it works. So let's always remember that, as we're kind of moving forward. oh man, I forgot the thought that was coming to my head from what Marguerite was saying. Hold on, give me 2 seconds. IBCLC's lactation consultants, dang it. Sorry, I haven't had all my coffee yet. I want to make sure that I want to close by saying 2 things. One, I want to let you all know about the Earth app. It's going to come to me. Let me start talking so I can respect your time. What we're doing at Earth in terms of creating this first Yelp-like review and rating platform for Black and Brown women and birthing people to find and leave reviews of their OBGYNs, birthing hospitals, and pediatricians. When you leave reviews in the Earth track for a birth, you are asked specifically about doctors, lactation consultants, and nurses. So now we're using crowdsourced information to start holding these systems accountable. And I think on Monday, I'm presenting some findings from Earth specific to what we're learning from Black women in hospital lactation support, their experiences of bias, what they feel that they are experiencing and not experiencing, where they're seeing support. And so we really want to start lifting up our community. Remember what I was going to say. Speaking of community, think about this model, right? And I want to say this particularly to the Black folks who are in birth work. There are 2 models when we think, and from a business perspective, think about the Tiffany's model, which is where you buy something very expensive. I live in New York City, and IBCLC is $400, $600 an hour basic, right? But there's also the Walmart model, which is you get a lot of people who are paying less for something, right? And the value that the Black people on this call have, in my experience, is that you have access to more people, right? And so in our communities, because we know there's such a need, is there a model that allows you to actually crowdsource more people, right, at a lower cost? And you can still think about that. I see that there's a membership model being built here through the Breaking Breastfeeding Barriers folks. I'm excited about seeing how folks can leverage those types of models that don't say you need $400 right now, but may say you need 10 pounds, 20 pounds a month for this period of time. So I just wanted to say that. And then lastly, I wanted to share just some news that I recently signed a small book deal to write a birth and breastfeeding book for Black folks in the UK, really putting on my journalist hat because I don't live there anymore, but to be a resource. And so to see how I could be able to use my journalistic skills and perhaps my platform to lift up the experiences of Black folks who are doing the work. So if you are, I'm asking all Black birth workers in the UK, I would love to interview you for this book. I would love to give you something for your time. I'm excited about being able to amplify your voices. So I'm going to put my email in the chat while Rosie is ushering me off the stage. And I would love to hear from anyone who would be willing to be interviewed for the book, which will be called Birthing in Color, the Black Woman's Guide to Birth and Breastfeeding. So excited to share that news and looking forward to seeing you all at the book launch next year. As soon as I get it done, keep me posted.
Oh, Kimberly, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your perspective and wisdom and insight that is so beautifully and so accessibly for us. I'm going to be going and watching and watching and watching and taking it all in. And yeah, the chat box is just thanking you over and over. We know many incredible practitioners who I'm sure will be in touch with you and make sure they get your email address so that they can be part of that process of birthing that book that we need. We need that. We need many. So thank you once again for your time and your energy and your wisdom.